Okay, let's get started because I have to do this super fast because I want to give you as much information as possible because I think it's really important to be able to come and share you these experiences. Most organizations who become victims of ransomware, they don't want to talk about it. They don't want to share the details. You would maybe never even hear about most of the ransomware cases. But I've been fortunate. Every now and again, I get involved in doing some give back to the community. And sometimes that giving back to the community is me going and helping in incidents, or, incident response, or ransomware cases, or advisory. In this particular case, I went involved into an incident response for a ransomware case. And the organization, it completely brought their business down to a complete standstill. Their business came to a stop. So I got permission from them to share their experience, to share their story. I can't really reveal the details, the exact information, and things in this session have been changed in order to protect their identity. But they wanted me to share their experience and share the exact techniques so that others will learn from it. And I think that's really important to be able to share that information. So I'm going to take you through this session. It's all about how attackers steal identities, what techniques they use in order to elevate privileges, and ultimately what's led to a basically completely disastrous catastrophe for a really large organization in Europe. So my name is Joseph Carson. I'm the Chief Security Scientist and Advisory CISO at Delinea, and I'm based in Tallinn, Estonia. So I came a really long way to come here to talk to you. I haven't slept in probably 2 days, so you'll just have to bear with me. I will promise I will stay awake for this session. So let's get through. One of the biggest things that I see from organizations, and in almost all incident responses and ransomware cases, is the high risk that we have from overprivileged users and overprivileged identities and overprivileged credentials. We tend to go where we want to make sure that users are productive, but at the same time, we don't think about how we want to reduce the risks and how we want to mitigate the risks. And we always think about the efficiencies and productivity and make sure employees are able to do the work they need to do. But we have to get to the point where we have to make security more usable, because the way we approach it today is we create a lot of friction and we force the employees to look for alternative ways to do their job. And those alternative ways are always taking huge risks for the business. At the same time, they're meeting their goals, but they're making massive exposure from a risk perspective. So we get into, this is the common attack path. And we see, and this is the exact attack path that I'll go through today. The first part is that what tends to be very unique for the organizations is the different ways that attackers gain that initial access. They might go through basically from phishing campaigns, might be the initial access, through application vulnerabilities, password reuse, compromised machines or devices from employees. The entry point tends to vary between different cases. But after the entry point, it's almost like an identical blueprint every single time. Every incident, it's almost like repeatable. You see this playbook, and you can go through it, and you can already know what the attacker was thinking and what steps they were going through. So it really gets into that entry point, which I'll show you the real entry point that happened in this case. But they end up looking to live off the land. They want to use their own tools, because anytime they introduce anything new, it creates noise. Attackers don't want to create noise. They want to stay stealthy. So the way they stay stealthy is to use your own tools that you're already using to manage your systems, your own SIEMs, your own vulnerability scanners, your own logging systems, your own authentication systems, your own tools for automation, for tasks, for basically ERP systems, your asset inventory. They will look to use your own tools to learn more. In many cases, they will learn more about your environment than you do yourselves. They will do such a great job at inventorying asset management and vulnerability scanning. They will know a lot about your environment. So they'll live off the land. The next part is getting into the persistence. They're always afraid that they'll lose the access. And sometimes this is where the access brokers focus on. So there's a whole criminal organization or supply chain of access brokers, and all they do is gain access, and then they sell the credentials off to other criminals who will use and abuse it. So in many cases, ransomware, you're always dealing with somewhere between maybe 4, 5, even 6 different criminal gangs who all expertise in different areas. The access brokers, the ransomware creators, the help desk team who help you pay the bitcoins or cryptocurrencies. You've got those who do the hands-on keyboard. So in many cases, sometimes even translation, because a lot of the criminals, they're not the same language or same location or regional location or time zone as you. In many cases, you have to work with intermediaries to communicate. Then they get into credential harvesting. That removes directory access, and ultimately this will lead to exfiltration of sensitive data, which we see a lot of the ransomware cases today, where it's rather than basically encrypting your devices, and making it inaccessible, they were stealing data and then selling it or threatening to sell it or disclose it in the public internet. So we get into these different types of variants, but this is the common attack path and the blueprint that happens. Now, this particular incident I'm going to go through today is based on the CryLock ransomware variant. Now, CryLock, I always find it interesting because this was one of the earlier variants of ransomware that was one of the first to be a ransomware as a service. It was actually this CryLock 2.0, which was an updated version of the CryAckle variant, which went to 1.6. This one was much more efficient, and it was the one where basically the creators of the ransomware didn't necessarily be the same that deployed it. They actually created an affiliate. Just like a channel program, they created a channel market for the ransomware itself. They make it available. They get a configuration tool in order for them to modify it and customize it for the attackers, who will then use the hands-on keyboard approach to either deploy it and deliver it out to victims. So this was one of the earlier versions or variants that was the ransomware as a service itself. You can see here, just to give you some background, they had 2 days, they would get a 50% discount. 4 days, they would actually potentially lose all access to their data. Just to give you an idea of the actually ransomware itself, the ransom demand was around 10 million euros, and a 50% discount would be 5 million. So that's what the organizations now faced with getting their business back. So, and this is what you're looking at on your machines and all your devices in the organization when you become a victim. Now, basically the contact details is different from those that will actually be the ones that they'll communicate through. When you find out you're a victim, it's going to be through various different methods. And in most cases, I've seen the actually ransomware criminals themselves reach out and contact the IT security team directly, because they've got access to your environment. They know your contact details. They probably even know your resume. They know your document history, your performance reviews. They know your employees' home addresses, contact information, even health data. When they have full access to your environment, they have a lot of information about the employees, where they live, how they communicate. So in many cases, you'll find out that the attackers will contact you directly. Sometimes they like to brag about it on social media, and that will force you into a bit of an urgency to do something quickly, because now the public know you're a victim. You sometimes hear about it from employees. Sometimes law enforcement might contact you directly, and even security researchers like myself might even reach out. And actually, this particular case, I actually did find another victim while I was investigating it and contacted them proactively. But that's a long story to do for this talk. We can do that over the breaks or later. The next thing is, of course, when you become a victim and you get notified, you're going to trigger an incident response plan. Now, I always say one of the biggest things that I always find organizations are doing wrong is they have an incident response plan, but they've never simulated or practiced it. They've done it for very specific use cases, but they have not practiced and simulated it in a real scenario. Or they've simulated it within isolated departments within the organization. When you're dealing with ransomware, ransomware is not an incident response. It's not a security incident. It's not an IT incident. It's a business incident. It's a business response. And you have to treat ransomware differently than you would an unauthorized access or a data theft. You actually have to deal ransomware as a business impact, and therefore it triggers a very different type of response, meaning you have to already have engagement with HR, with your lawyers, with your financial team, with your suppliers. So it's always good when you're doing a simulation, make sure you simulate it as real as you possibly can. Because when you simulate it, you find a lot of things where time formats and naming conventions, time zones is a big thing. When I'm dealing with this response, what time zone are you going to do your logs and your images from? Because that makes a big difference in your forensics and your evidence gathering process. You get into also about even storage. I've seen organizations doing same-day delivery because they don't realize how much storage space they will need in order to create images of all the machines in the environment for basically forensics evidence gathering. And you're talking about sometimes terabytes of space. Who's going to have access to it? Another big area is around identities and access. Every single incident that I get into, when I'm giving an identity in order to do the forensics evidence gathering, in many cases, it's the same identities the attackers have access to. So you're contaminating the evidence by actually using the same identities the attackers have access to. So it's always so important to make sure you have that segregation of duties and you've got accounts set aside for incident response that are only intentionally used for that. And that will help you keep that separation of audit trails, because when you're doing an incident response for ransomware, the audit trail is so critical. It's so important because you actually, in many cases, you don't have a lot of information to go by. So the more information you have and the more you collect and the more it's still available. It's almost like, one metaphor I use, it's like somebody giving me a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, throwing 9,000 pieces away, and then giving me a couple of pieces left, and I have to understand what the big picture was. what the attackers are doing, and it's very little information to actually be able to understand the attack path. So doing a simulation is so critical. Then you get into, you'll have very few choices about how to recover. And I really hope that you're not in the situation where you don't have a backup. It's important to have a ransomware resilient backup. In the actual incident that I'm going to show the demonstration today, their backup was on a flat network, and their backup was focused at actually fast recovery, which meant that it had the same credentials as the production, as the backup environment had, so their backup was completely encrypted as well. And that's the situation you're in. I've seen even where companies have had backups, and they restored the backup, and then realized that they actually had backed up the ransomware, and they restored it from the backup to production again, and then a few weeks later, bang, disaster happens again. So these tend to be the three scenarios. You're going to restore from a backup if you have a good one available. You end up going to decide to pay the ransom. This organization was considering paying the ransom, or they were going to rebuild. They were fortunate enough to find a machine that they actually did a migration 1 year before, which is a hardware migration, and they still had the old piece of hardware remaining. So they were fortunate enough to find a machine that they actually created a baseline of. That was 1 year old. It meant that the organization now had lost 1 year's worth of their business. And when I talk about what would it be like for your business to lose 1 year of data? All the employees who started in that year, you don't have their resumes, you don't have their employment data, you don't have their information about payments, invoices, supply chains, stock information. All of that's gone. They had to spend 3 months rebuilding that. So they actually did a combination between the first one and the last one here. They actually had to spend a couple of months with a bunch of people recreating that 1 year's worth of their business. And this is what you face when you're a victim. One of the things I look at is ultimately what do the attackers have access in order to create the attack path, to simulate it, to understand what the attackers were thinking when they were going through this scenario. And the understanding about did they have full domain access, because then you're facing potentially a complete rebuild of your domain controllers and Active Directory because you can't trust them anymore. Where's the level of trust if you don't know what they've changed or modified? What data they have access? How long has it been going on for? What tools did they use? What backdoors? These are all the questions you go through when you're dealing with a ransomware case. Now, to give you kind of context, the attack itself, when I was able to do the super timeline, it's been going on for 7 months. The initial access happened 7 months prior by initial access. Then later, they checked it 2 times before they sold it on to other criminals who then did the hands-on keyboard, who then purchased or were able to get an affiliate program with the actually CryLock ransomware team, and then they deployed that, and then they used a help desk team in order to help actually communicate with the actually victims about how to negotiate. So you're looking at a 7-month timeline in this attack. The attack itself was 2 weeks hands-on keyboard, and I want to show the demo because I'm really thinking about timelines here. So let me take you through the scenario. So this is ultimately what happened with this victim. So we all basically go through and we all think about, organizations have tons of security in place. You've got things where you've got, VPN access, and you've got multi-factor authentication. But what's one of the areas that basically every employee is walking around and they have mobile phones, they basically have internets in their pockets, and they can create basically access into the organization. In this particular case, the accountant needed to have access to a financial system and therefore called up the hosting provider directly outside the knowledge of IT, outside the knowledge of a security team. They didn't even know this was happening. And ultimately, they had a public-facing RDP access to a server. Within seconds, the initial access brokers started brute forcing that machine. And ultimately, going through all the different attempts, it's only a matter of time before, if you've got human-created credentials that we leave employees and people to make those decisions, it's only a matter of time before the attackers will find basically chosen word lists in order to be able to crack and brute force those. In this case, I've changed the passwords from the real scenario to the simple version, but ultimately it's only a matter of time before the attacker is able to then gain basically initial access to a system. So they've been able to brute force, they've got the user credentials, and they now have a basically username and password. So what they can now do is log on, simulate that accountant's experience. So the accountant had access to the server that was public facing, they now have the credentials, and they can log on under that accountant's credentials. So this is the state that I found this particular machine in. So everything we see here is identical to this victim's accountant's machine. Now, I'm not kidding you. On the desktop was a file called important stuff. And when you open up the file called important stuff, what this accountant decided to do was to make their lives easier by storing the actual credentials of the financial database, the SQL server, and the actual server IP address and everything on the desktop in a clear text file. So you're already thinking about, oh my goodness, what are you dealing with? But this is exactly what users do. They will take the easy path to do their job. Now, the next thing that you always find is another interesting thing, is that we all know that what the browsers love. Browsers love cookies, if you're in England, biscuits, and passwords. So one of the things is that going to a browser, the attackers also know by simply going and clicking and looking at passwords, all the passwords that basically this user has used through the browser to access from this machine is now saved in clear text in the browser. But it's great that browsers have security by design, but it's useless unless you have security by default. If you don't turn it on and use it, it's basically going to be easier access for the attackers to go through. And again, you can see here, the attacker then can simply go and look at their basically accounts, they can access, and the attackers at this point even had access to the accountant's personal email address. So their personal email information. And you think about what's in your email, imagine an attacker getting access to your information. That's a lot of sensitive areas, because then they can go and start resetting passwords and credentials. So the next stage is, okay, they've got access, they want to now elevate privileges. So what they're going to start doing is they're start doing enumeration, and they're going to try and find out what types of privilege they have. So here they'll go simply onto the command prompt and take a look and say, who am I? Well, I'm Neo in the Matrix. And then they'll simply say, well, what permissions has this organization giving me? And the organization had given them local administrator rights, which we find many cases, developers, people in executive positions or people who need access to certain applications, organizations tend to go and give local administrator rights. And this is a big mistake. It's one of the biggest mistakes I see continuously over and over and over again. By giving local administrator, we sometimes have it in our minds that local admin is local to this one machine and it can do no other damage to the environment. But the attackers know that. They know that it's only 2 steps to go from local admin to full domain admin. 2 steps. And they know that, and they'll go searching. And if they hit the jackpot in the first time, that's a shame. But they'll go searching for local administrators on the environment. They'll move around, they'll laterally move, they'll create backdoors, they'll start looking for credential harvesting. They want to get that local administrator because in many cases, we're not managing it. We're not monitoring it. We're not putting additional security controls in place because sometimes we assume that the defense is at the perimeter. But you can see here, by me simply just having that compromised initial access, I'm now within the perimeter and now looking around and seeing what other credentials I can find. So with a local administrator, what can I do? Well, the next thing I will do as an attacker is I'll download some automation tools. Now, these automation tools are the same scripts that was used in this ransomware case. And you'll see here there's a script called Disable Security. And if I go and show you what's in this Disable Security script, as a local administrator, I can run this. And it will go through and it'll disable the security in this machine. And it will disable any EDR, AV solutions, firewalls, everything will be disabled. Now, it only gives me a short period of time because these processes and services are protected services. They will basically restart themselves after a certain amount of time, which the attackers know that. So the sessions tend to be 4 minutes to 8 minutes long, and they stay within that window of the protected services so they can do their malicious activities. So here, they can now disable security. Now, anything they do is now basically unknown to the IT and security team. So the next thing they'll do is they'll do a downloader, and this will download the next malicious packages. They might even go and do sticky keys to create some backdoors in the machine. So in the fear that the user ever changes their password, they have an easy way back on the machine by having sticky keys enabled. I'll show you what sticky keys is. This is an issue that's been around for many years, and attackers still commonly use it today. Now the attacker basically has disabled security, so they're staying under the radar. The next thing they'll then download is Mimikatz or other tools to do privilege escalation. Now with privilege escalation, they might have to do a few changes in later operating systems. So in later versions of Windows, of course, they will go and enable these registry credentials or registry entries, which will make passwords then, any password after this change will be displayed in clear text and memory. So a simple change to be able to then know how, the next stage is the attackers will want to, how they can lure anyone with domain or higher level privileges to log onto this machine. And they will go through things like, causing problems with the disk space. They might cause problems with applications. And when somebody has a problem with the application, who do they call? The help desk. What does the help desk do? They log onto the machine with what? Domain administrator credentials so they can do the troubleshooting. So they're always looking to lure those administrators to log in after making those changes. They'll go and dump the credentials. This is the exact actually script that was used by the attackers to dump credentials. So they went through, checked the processor. They made it really pretty. They changed the colors of the screen and stuff. It was really so they made it pretty for themselves. I don't know if it's just something they like doing, I guess. But then it'll run and dump the credentials. Of course, the first time they run it, there's going to be just the credentials that they've compromised since they've actually gained access. So what they'll do is they'll go back, they'll run a clean script, they'll go away for a few days, do whatever, maybe target other victims, maybe go and check on other scripts that they've run, and then they'll come back and rerun it again, do the disable security, download the malicious files, execute them, and seeing have they captured any credentials since that change they made. And it's only a matter of time before basically somebody logs in, and if they haven't lured or haven't been able to go and check, it's only a matter of time before somebody will come in and actually log in this machine. In this particular environment, what was actually running in the background was a backup job. Ironically, a backup job. The backup job is running under a domain administrator, and every 2 days it would log into this financial database and actually take a backup of the database every 2 days. And it was running a scheduled task. It was using PSExact to do the connection. So they only had to wait 2 days, log back on after that backup job run, and they now have full domain administrator credentials. So the backup is what exposed the credentials to the attacker. So now the attacker can simply just basically come back out. They can do an RDP to the domain controller, log on with the credentials they were able to get from the actual script, and now it's game over. Now it's only a matter of time before the attackers enumerate the entire environment, find out all of your information that you're collecting on employees, contact information, and then ultimately go and deploy ransomware. And ultimately the ransomware will look like this. This is the ransomware running in this environment. You'll see it here, the CryLock running on the desktop. It will execute, and then basically it will copy itself into the temporary folder. So it would actually create a spawn child process in the temporary folder. It will kill the parent process and delete itself. It will hide itself within the system. It will actually create a command and control back out to the internet to tell the ransomware creators that there's a new victim that you should go and investigate and check and see if you can get actually some ransom payments from them. This machine only takes 3 minutes from start to finish, 150 gigs of data to encrypt. And ultimately, at the end of this, you'll get the prompt to show that you've become a victim. This is what this organization faced from the ransomware case. And we can go through here and we can actually go and see, well, what things can you learn from this? What can we actually take away from this? It's so important to make sure, these are my top tips about how this organization could have avoided becoming a victim. Good education knowledge about how to make sure, how to understand how the attackers think. What's their mindset? What are they going through? It was really interesting as well, if I showed the machine, actually go back and I can show you ultimately what they can then do, is now they have full access to this machine. They can simply come and they can go and run the same backup script and have access to the machine itself, basically through command line. They can also go and do basically pass the hash, so they have full access to the domain controller. And if they ever lose access, they can simply just log out of here. And I'll show you what the sticky keys looks like if you're not familiar with it. So let's say I then come back in and I try to log in this machine, and I try basically, and the password's changed. With sticky keys, I can simply just go to ease of use help, and I'll get a full command prompt, which is a local administrator, or full actually authority system. And I can go and change the password and re-access again. So the attackers are setting this all up for persistence, for returning, and be able to get back, all going through. So education knowledge about all these techniques. You should be proactive. You should be looking for them. Backup and test plan that is tailored for ransomware, business resilient, that is actually making sure you're doing proper segmentation. The credentials should not be the same as the backup as it is for production. It should be one directional. It should be only going from the backup environment to production and taking it in. There shouldn't be two directional communications. Zero trust in the principle of least privilege. This user should have never been a local administrator in the system. Should never been. They have no need for it. And just for them to do their work, use other ways of doing privilege escalation, just-in-time privilege escalation, and so forth. Privilege access management. The password for that script should have been rotated after every single use. So that backup job that was running, basically the password, if I was able to gain it, it should not be usable for me returning later. So having a good privilege access management solution. Application control, that even if I was able to disable some of the security in the system, I should not be able to run any other malicious applications which are not trusted or not known to the environment. and especially introducing anything new, should create a lot of noise, and then having a good patch and updating of security. The big part here is making sure that you actually force the attackers to create a lot of noise. The more noise they create in your environment, the more chance you have at seeing them. Because for me, going back and looking at this now, the logs were screaming for help. They were screaming for someone to look at them. And this ultimately is where we should make sure that we're stopping the attackers at the beginning and not at the end. So at this point in time, I hope this was educational, whirlwind tour, as fast as going through a ransomware case as possible. I don't know if we have time for questions. I think my time is up. I apologize. Thank you for attending the session. I'm going to be around here for the rest of the week. If you do have questions about this case, if you want to learn more, I'm around. Feel free. Always provide feedback. The more feedback you provide, the more chance I have of coming back. Take care. Enjoy the conference. Stay safe, and thank you.